In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And the first skull of the morning, which was not a good skull, too thin at the temple, cracked along the sagittal suture from a blow that landed 3 fingers too high, and the jaw came away during removal, because Moldren is enthusiastic about the downward stroke and indifferent to anything that happens after the body hits the ground. He has always been this way. He kills the way a reactor vents. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Vaust Kelvain, once 3rd captain of the Steenvolt, now the Yardsman, 411 years running the fighting yard aboard the Brenkeld between campaigns. He hoses the deck, he mounts the sculls. He knows that stain the way a cartographer knows his coastline. This is a day off, and nobody else aboard has any interest in what a room looks like after the killing is done. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first skull of the morning belonged to a brother named Reuven, and it was not a good skull. Too thin at the temple, cracked along the sagittal suture from a blow that should have landed 3 fingers lower, and the jaw had come away during removal because Moldren is enthusiastic about the downward stroke and indifferent to anything that happens after the body hits the ground. He has always been this way. He kills the way a reactor vents, hot and total, and with no interest in what remains when the heat is gone. I told him about the jaw, and he looked at me the way he always looks at me when I mention something that happened after the killing, which is to say he did not look at me at all. He was already running oil along the housing of his chain axe, with the cloth he keeps threaded through his belt. The teeth needed realignment. The teeth always need realignment when Moldren fights, because Moldren does not strike with the blade as much as he drives the weapon through whatever stands in front of him, and a chain axe used as a battering ram wears differently than a chain axe used as an edge. I have told him so for 2 centuries, and his response has never once varied. That was the opening event of a day off aboard the Brenkeld. 8 minutes past the 7th bell, which is the bell Grisic has designated as the start of the ship's arbitrary morning cycle, because the reactor output peaks near that mark, and the lumens in the upper decks run slightly brighter for about 40 minutes, and that is the closest this vessel will ever come to dawn. I stood in the yard with Reuven's skull in one hand and his jaw in the other, and decided the jaw was not salvageable. I threw it over the railing into the lower drainage channel where the serfs would collect it with everything else that accumulates during a fighting cycle, and I carried the skull to the consecration rack at the eastern wall, and I placed it with the other 19 already waiting. Then I hosed the yard. The hose is a length of salvaged coolant pipe that Grisic cut and threaded for me 11 years ago, and it connects to a reservoir tank bolted to the wall above the yard at a height that gives adequate pressure for about 6 minutes before the flow drops to a trickle. 6 minutes is enough. The yard is not large. It is a cargo staging bay on the Brenkeld's port side mid-deck, 22 meters by 15, with the original deck plating still visible under the staining that no amount of water will remove because the blood has been settling into the grain of the metal for longer than most planetary civilizations have existed. The walls are bare hull. The ceiling is open ductwork and cable runs. There are no stands, no viewing galleries, no ornamentation of any kind. It is a room in which people kill each other, and it looks exactly like that, and I maintain it the way I maintain it because I am the one who maintains it, and nobody else aboard this ship has any interest in what a room looks like after the killing is done. My name is Vaust Kelvain. I was the 3rd captain of the Steenvolt, which was a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, in a time when that designation meant something to me, and for a time before that I was a sergeant of the 7th Company, and for a time before that I was a line brother who had not yet learned how to use the quiet hours without losing something in them. Now I am none of those things. Now I am the yardsman. I run the fighting yard aboard the Brenkeld during the lulls between campaigns, and I have held this role for 411 years, since the day the previous yardsman died in the yard, and Skelvorn looked at me across the body and said nothing, which was how I learned I had been reassigned. In that time, I have hosed this deck more times than I can reconstruct with any confidence, because the warp makes a nonsense of intervals, and the count stopped mattering somewhere in the 2nd century. But the stain has not lightened once. I mention this not because the number matters, but because the stain does. The yard remembers. It remembers better than I do, which is not a compliment to the yard so much as an honest accounting of what 4 centuries of managing other people's violence does to the finer points of recollection. I know the stain the way a cartographer knows his coastline. I can tell you which marks are old, the deep black-brown that has bonded with the alloy at a molecular level and will be there when the ship finally breaks apart, and which are recent, still carrying the wet sheen that fades over a few days into the same matte darkness as everything else. The fresh ones are Reuven. The old ones are everyone. The Stenvault were a chapter, 7th founding, drawn from the line of Dorn through a successor I will not name, because the name would mean nothing to you and meant less to us by the time it mattered. We were siege assault specialists, breaching actions, wall clearances, room-to-room prosecution of defended positions. The chapter that went in first and came out last and counted its success in fortifications rendered inoperable. We were not patient the way the Imperial fists are patient. We were patient the way a cutting tool is patient. You do not rush a drill through a blast door. You apply pressure at the correct point, at the correct rate, and the door opens when it opens, and impatience only costs you the bit. That is what we were. That is how we thought. We applied pressure, and we watched things give way, and we were very good at it, and we were good at it for a very long time. The fall was not dramatic. The versions that circulate among the newer mortal auxiliaries are all dramatic and all wrong. Nobody heard a voice. Nobody found an artifact in the walls of a dead fortress that whispered promises of glory. Nobody made a pact in a moment of desperation. What happened was slower and less interesting than any of those stories, and it was this. We spent 7 centuries breaching fortifications and clearing kill zones and fighting in rooms so tight that a chainsword was more useful as a pry bar than as a weapon. And at some point during those 7 centuries, the violence stopped being the cost of the objective and became the objective. I do not know when. Nobody does. The chaplains led the charges before the apothecaries noticed the gene seed had started rejecting the more docile aspirants. The sergeants were requesting close quarters deployments before the captains noticed the chapter had stopped accepting contracts that did not involve breaching. And by the time the chapter master, his name was Veyrond, and he was a better man than anything that came after him, sat down with the reclusiarch and the chief apothecary and tried to address the trajectory. The trajectory had already passed the point where addressing it was a thing the chapter was capable of wanting to do. Veyrond spoke for 2 hours. The reclusiarch listened. Then the reclusiarch killed Veyrond with his Crozius in the chapter master's own strategium, and the act took 4 seconds. And nobody in the room moved to stop it, because nobody in the room wanted it stopped. His skull is on the shrine wall, 3rd row, western side. It was mounted before the rack had a schedule, and it has never been reseated, and the spike is corroding, and one day I will have to decide whether to touch it. That was 819 years ago, give or take whatever the warp has made of the intervals. The Reclusiarch is dead now too, killed in a boarding action against a Black Templar strike cruiser in the 2nd century after the fall. The Black Templars came looking for us specifically, and I know why. Because the answer was painted under 400 years of our own overpaint on the Brenkeld's prow, and Grissork found it during a hull repair in the 2nd century. She was not a Navy hull sitting in a Navy dry dock by accident. She belonged to a chapter, and the chapter she belonged to had put her in for a refit she never came out of. And 800 dock workers and 60 ratings died because we wanted her, and they were standing between us and the mooring clamps. I am not going to name the chapter. The name is on the prow under the paint, and it will be there when this hull breaks up, and every brother aboard knows it is there, and nobody has ever suggested stripping it back, because a war band that scrubs off what it took is a war band apologizing. So they came, and they were not there for the cargo or the position or the tithe. They were there for the ship and for what taking her had said about them, and it cost them a strike cruiser and about 160 brothers to say so. And then nobody came again. We did not beat them. We survived them, which is a different thing. And a grudge like that gets triaged the same as everything else in a galaxy on fire in 10,000 places at once. Somebody in that chapter has a file open on us. It has been open for 600 years. It will stay open. It is simply never the most urgent file on the desk, and that, and not our strength, is the reason there is anyone left aboard this hull to have a day off. They brought 200 brothers and a fighting company of neophytes, and they hit the Brenkeld amidships with 3 boarding torpedoes, and they killed 41 of us in 9 hours of corridor fighting before we drove them back to their hull. They also lost their strike cruiser, which is now a reef of wreckage in the orbit of a gas giant whose name I have forgotten, and the whole engagement was exactly the kind of war we had been built for, and they had not, and the lesson was expensive for them and free for us. Other things have come, smaller, less committed, less well-informed. A Grey Knight cost them the kill team, and I will not discuss those 9 minutes further, because nobody aboard who was present discusses them. But I will say what they came for, because it matters to the rest of this. They did not come for us. 12 of them boarded a ship holding 180 brothers, which is not a force sent to destroy a warband, and they did not fight their way toward the strategium, or the engineerium, or the bridge. They went for the shrine. They knew where it was on a hull they had never been aboard, and they went up through 3 decks toward the brass in a straight line, and they were 40 meters short of the chamber door when the last of them went down. Whatever the Ordo Malleus keeps in its files about the Sten Vault, the entry is not about 180 renegades. It is about a piece of furniture on a dais that has been taking offerings since the 1st century after the fall, and about what that kind of object becomes if nobody interrupts it. They thought it was worth 12 of them. I have carried that for 500 years, and it sits differently now that the thing they came for has gone cold under my hand. The point is that we have been here for a long time, and we have been killing for the whole of it, and the reason we are still here is not that we are the most dangerous thing in whatever subsector we happen to occupy at any given time. We are still here because we are not worth the cost of removing. That is the truth, and it is not flattering. And the newer brothers do not enjoy hearing it, and I tell it to them anyway because the yardsman's first duty is to keep things honest, even when honesty is the last thing anybody in the yard wants to hear. The Brenkeld is a battle barge. She was laid down at a yard I cannot identify, for a Chapter 1 will not name in a millennium I no longer remember, and we took her from a sector fleet anchorage during the 3rd decade after the fall, Because the ship we had been using was dying, and a battle barge was sitting in a dry dock with a skeleton crew and an incomplete refit and no escort within interdiction range. We killed 800 dock workers and a naval security detachment of perhaps 60 ratings, and we took the ship and we renamed her, and she has been ours since. She is old. She is not in good condition. Grisok, who is the closest thing we have to a warpsmith, and whose actual title aboard this ship is the one he chose for himself, which is simply Keeper, says the keel has approximately 4 centuries of service left in it if we do not take any more hits to the ventral plating, and perhaps 2 if we do. The reactors are original, and they function because Grisok talks to them in a language I do not recognize and does things to their innards that I do not watch. And the Geller field is a patchwork of 3 separate systems scavenged from 2 Imperial wrecks and a transport we captured off a convoy route near the Dolvanath Reach. And the field holds because it holds, and I do not ask further questions about the field because the answers Grisok gives about the field are not the kind of answers that make a man feel better about spending weeks inside it. We also have a navigator. She is kept in a sealed compartment forward of the bridge that nobody enters except Grisok and the 2 mortal attendants who feed her, and she has been aboard since we took the ship. And she was aboard before we took the ship, which is to say we did not kill her when we killed everyone else because a battle barge without a navigator is a very large coffin. Skelvorn has never spoken to her. No brother has. The warp-touched are contemptible to us in a way I will not waste words explaining, and the fact that we cannot make a crossing without one is a thing the warband has resolved by pretending the compartment forward of the bridge is empty. Food goes in. Maintenance goes in. When the order comes to translate, whatever is behind that door does what it does, and we arrive somewhere approximately correct. I have not seen her and do not intend to. We are 163 brothers. That morning the crossbar was bowing again under the 20 skulls. And a bowing crossbar drops offerings, so I reseated it and thought about the number while I worked. That number is not stable. It changes on the days when the yard produces a death that was not planned, and it changes on the days when we take a world and some of us do not come back. And it changes on the rare occasions when we acquire a new brother through means I will describe later, because the means are relevant to what a day off looks like and what a day off costs. Below the Astartes decks, in the lower compartments and the cargo bays, and the engineerium sub-levels, and the mortal berthing blocks that fill the belly of a ship designed to carry thousands, we have approximately 2,400 mortals, cultists, slaves, crew born aboard the ship who have never seen a sky and would not know what to do under one. Press-ganged ratings from a dozen different vessels we have raided across the centuries. Thralls sworn to individual brothers. Chattel without a designation who exist in the gaps between the categories I have just listed and whose survival depends on their ability to be useful without being visible. 2,400 human beings living inside the body of a warship that was built to serve the Emperor and now serves something else, and every one of them knows that their continued existence is a function of utility and nothing more. And the ones who survive longest are the ones who understood that on their first day aboard, and have never made the mistake of hoping it might be otherwise. That is the ship. That is the warband. That is the population. And now I will tell you what happens when all of that has nowhere to go. A campaign ends. I have watched it end 30 or 40 times from this deck, with the hose in my hand and the water running out. The last world burns or surrenders, or is scoured to the bedrock, or is simply abandoned after we have taken what we came for, and the Brenkeld breaks orbit and translates into the warp, and the weeks begin. Weeks in the warp are not weeks. I say that once, and I will not repeat it. Time aboard this ship during transit is a suggestion rather than a measurement, and the clocks run because Grisick tells them to run, and the bells ring because the routine demands bells, and nobody aboard is under the illusion that the intervals between them correspond to anything real. We cross, we arrive, we take position in whatever system Skelvorn has designated, usually at the trailing edge of a debris field or in the shadow of a dead moon, or somewhere equally uninteresting to anyone whose instruments might be sweeping the local void. And we wait. And the waiting is where the killing starts. Not the kind of killing I was built for, not the kind that has an objective attached to it, a fortification to breach, a wall to bring down, a city to clear room by room with the chain axe singing and the bolt pistol barking, and every nerve in my body lit up like a ship-wide alarm because the blood god is watching, and his attention is the only warmth that matters. That killing has a shape to it. It has a beginning and an end and a purpose that sits between them like a spine, and you can hold yourself against it the way you hold yourself against a bulkhead in rough transit. It keeps you upright. It gives you something to push against. It tells your muscles what to do with the force they are generating. Campaign killing is structured. Campaign killing is almost comfortable. And then the campaign ends and the shape goes away, and you are standing in a metal room with nothing in front of you and nothing behind you, and the same fire burning in the same furnace, in the same chest as always. And the fire does not know the campaign is over, and the fire does not care, and the fire wants what the fire has always wanted, and what the fire wants is more. That is what a day off looks like for a Chaos Space Marine. It looks like a man standing in a room trying not to break the walls with his hands, because the walls are all that is keeping the void out, and the void is all that is keeping the ship afloat, and the ship is all that is keeping him alive long enough to find something else to kill. It looks like a chain axe sitting in its rack 6 feet away, and the distance between the hand and the rack feeling like the longest distance in the galaxy. It looks like a heartbeat that should be resting and is instead running at full combat tempo for no reason other than that nothing has told it to stop. We do not sleep the way a man sleeps. I say this without drama and without self-pity, because it is a mechanical fact, and it deserves to be stated as one. The catalepsian node lets half the brain shut down while the other half stays active, and this is useful in combat because it means a brother can fight for weeks without true rest. And it is useful on campaign because it means a sentry never drifts, and it is the single worst implant in the entire Astartes surgical suite for a warrior whose problem is not exhaustion, but the opposite. A mortal man gets 8 hours a night of not being himself. 8 hours of oblivion in which the thing inside him that wants to break and burn and tear goes quiet because the consciousness driving it has temporarily left the building. We do not get that. We get 72 hours, or 96, or 140, or however long the lull lasts, of unbroken waking awareness with the full weight of what we are pressing against the inside of the skull without a single moment of relief. The fire burns at the same temperature at hour 1 as it does at hour 90, and at hour 90 you have been carrying it for 90 hours without putting it down, and there is no mechanism anywhere in this body that will let you put it down. That is my job. I am the mechanism. I am the thing that stands between 163 brothers and the 90 hours, and the tool I use is the yard, and the yard is 22 meters by 15, and it is never enough. And it is all I have. The yard runs on a schedule. I built the schedule myself in the first decade of holding the post, and I have revised it perhaps 9 times since, and its current form is the result of 4 centuries of observing what happens when Astartes, who worship the blood god, have nothing productive to do with their hands. The schedule is simple. Between the 7th bell and the 11th bell, the yard is open for individual combat, challenges, disputes, grudge matches, whatever a brother brings to the floor that involves himself and one other brother and their personal weapons. No ranged, no explosives, no power fields unless both parties agree. And both parties rarely agree, because a power weapon in a space this size tends to end things before the blood has time to mean anything, and blood that is spilled too quickly is blood that the god does not taste. Between the 11th bell and the 15th bell, the yard is closed. I clean. I inspect the deck for structural damage. I check the drainage channels for blockage, bone fragments, teeth, sections of armor plate that have been driven into the grating by a falling body, all the ordinary debris of a fighting floor that accumulates faster than any mortal cleaning crew can manage. I replace the consecration rack if it needs replacing, which it does about every 10 days because the weight of the skulls warps the crossbar, and a warped rack is a rack that drops offerings, and a skull that falls off a consecration rack and rolls across the deck is not an auspicious thing to have happen in front of brothers who are already looking for signs. Between the 15th bell and the 19th bell, the yard reopens for scheduled bouts. These are the fights I arrange. These are my fights, in the sense that I select the combatants, I set the terms, and I stand at the edge of the floor and watch them, and do not intervene unless the terms are broken, which happens rarely because breaking terms in my yard carries a penalty that I have been reliably consistent about for 400 years, and consistency in penalty is the only authority a yardsman has. Morning and evening are not the same session. The difference between them is the difference between a fire that starts itself and a fire that somebody lights. In the morning, brothers come to the yard because they need to, because the pressure has built overnight, and the alternative to fighting another brother is fighting the wall, or fighting the voices, or fighting the thing inside them that does not have a name and does not need one, because what it wants is too simple for language. Morning fights are raw. They are ugly. They end fast and they end bloody, and the skill level is low because skill requires focus, and focus is the first thing the lull takes away. I have seen brothers of 4 centuries' experience fight like fresh inductees in the morning session, because the night has stripped them back to the base function, and the base function does not know technique. It only knows forward. I do not enjoy the morning session. It is poor work, slaughterhouse work. The blood is real and the death is real, and the god may or may not be watching. But the fighting is not fighting. It is venting, and I was trained by men who knew the difference. The evening session is mine. I pair the combatants by weight, by capability, by temperament, by whatever axis I judge will produce the most technically demanding bout, because a technically demanding bout lasts longer and generates better blood and puts a better skull on the rack, if it ends that way. And it usually does not end that way because the evening fights are fought to submission or incapacitation rather than to death. And the difference matters more than you might expect. A brother who dies in the morning session is a brother the war band did not need badly enough to keep. A brother who fights in the evening session and submits is a brother who has demonstrated control, which in a Khorne war band is not a virtue, but is a survival trait. And survival traits are what keep a war band above the threshold where it can still take a world. 163 is not a large number. We have lost brothers to the yard in every lull since I took the post, and the rate has held at between 2 and 5 per lull, depending on the duration and the intensity of what came before. And the rate is acceptable because the alternative is not having the yard, and losing more than that to corridor fights and bay brawls and the kind of unstructured fratricide that killed more Khornate warbands in the centuries after the heresy than any loyalist force ever managed. The yard is a valve. I am the hand on the valve. I should tell you about the captives. Not because the captives are interesting. They are not in themselves any more interesting than ammunition or fuel or food stock or any other consumable that the war band requires in order to function, but because the captives are central to what a day off looks like, and specifically to what it looks like for the 2,400 mortals living in the belly of this ship, for whom a day off means something very different than it means for a brother. The captive pens are on the deck below the yard. I can hear them through the floor plating during the quiet periods between sessions, when the yard is empty and the hose has run dry, and the only sound is the low hum of the Brenkeld's drives and the clicking of cooling metal and the distant rhythm of the mortal decks below that, and under all of that, through the steel, the sound of people. Not screaming, not crying, not praying, though some of them pray. And the prayers are always to the Emperor, which I find neither offensive nor meaningful, because a man who has been in a cage for 11 weeks, praying to a god who has not answered, is not performing an act of devotion. He is performing an act of habit, and habit is the last thing to go. The sound is breathing. Hundreds of people breathing in a confined space, and the breath has a texture to it when you hear it through hull plating. Damp, close, heavy, the kind of sound that settles into the lower frequencies and sits there like ballast. The yard is directly above the pens, and the blood from the yard drains through the deck, grating into collection channels that run along the ceiling of the pen compartment, and the captives can hear the fighting above them, the way footsteps carry into a basement, and they can see the blood coming through the ceiling the same way, one drop at a time. This is not an accident of architecture. I arranged it this way in my 9th year, when the pens were 2 decks further aft, and the captives could not hear the yard at all, and the problem with captives who cannot hear the yard is that they do not understand what is above them, and a captive who does not understand is a captive who nurtures hope, and hope in a captive is a parasite that consumes their will and replaces it with something brittle and useless. A captive who can hear the yard knows what he is. A captive who can see the blood coming through the ceiling knows where he is going. And a captive who knows both of those things does not waste his remaining time on hope, and what he does instead, which is either rage or despair, or a kind of flat, practical resignation that I find the most useful of the 3, produces a man who fights properly when his turn comes. The turns come during the evening session, not every evening, not on a schedule the captives can predict, because predictability would give them something to count toward, and a man who is counting down is a man who has located the boundary of his endurance and drawn a line at it, and a man who has drawn a line will collapse the moment the line is crossed. I pull captives for the evening bouts when a brother requests it, which is most lulls, or when I judge that a particular pairing between 2 brothers would benefit from the addition of a third party whose participation is involuntary. A brother fighting another brother fights with restraint because the brother across from him is a resource, and killing a resource without cause is waste, and Skelvorn punishes waste. A brother fighting a captive fights without restraint because the captive is stock and stock exists to be consumed, and the difference in how a brother moves when restraint is removed is information I use to calibrate the next round of pairings. The captives die. That is what captives are for. Some of them die well, with a weapon in their hand, stolen or issued, making contact at least once before the bolt pistol or the axe or the bare ceramite gauntlet closes the account. And those deaths go on the rack and the skulls are taken, and the god receives what the god is owed. Some of them die poorly, on their knees with their arms over their heads, and the sound they make is not the sound of a warrior, and the blood is not the blood of a warrior, and those offerings go into the drainage channel with the rest of the wash, and the god's view of those offerings is the god's business and not mine. Skelvorn needs describing, and not at length, because Skelvorn is not a man who invites description, and I am not a man who enjoys providing it. But enough that the shape of the warband makes sense to you, because the warband is his shape, and it does not make sense without him. Skelvorn was the Reclusiarch. He is the one who killed Chapter Master Verund in the Strategium with a Crozius blow that took 4 seconds to deliver and 8 centuries to arrive at. And he has been the Lord of the Sten Vault since that moment. And in the time between then and now, he has not changed his title, his methods, or his armor. And the only thing about him that has changed is the reason this particular day off is not the same as the ones before it. The Lord holds court in the hall, which is the old Strategium, the same room where Verund died. He sits in a command throne that was built for a chapter master and is now occupied by the man who killed the chapter master who sat in it, and nobody aboard has ever remarked on it, including Skelvorn, because remarking would require a sense of proportion. And proportion is not among the gifts the blood god distributes to his faithful. The hall is large. It has a dais and a vaulted ceiling, and the walls are lined with trophy racks, skulls mostly, but also weapons taken from enemies of note. A Black Templar sword that Skelvorn claimed personally during the boarding, the broken fragments of a Grey Knight's Nemesis Force weapon that I will not describe further, sections of armor plate bearing the insignia of regiments and chapters, and in one case, an inquisitorial rosette that belongs to a dead woman whose name is scratched into the brass below it, and whose death is not discussed. The hall has the feel of a place that was designed for strategy, and has been repurposed for something that does not require a table because the table is gone. Skelvorn removed it in the 2nd century. He does not plan in the way that a strategium demands. He sits in the throne and he listens to the reports that come to him. Grisic on the ship, myself on the yard, Moldrin on the armory, Kellak on the mortal decks. And he issues orders that are brief and absolute and do not invite discussion. Then he sits in silence until the next report arrives, or the next lull ends, or the next brother walks through the door with a challenge or a grievance or a request for resources. He deals with each of those the same way, which is to listen until the speaker has finished, and then to say the least number of words that will resolve the matter. And if the matter cannot be resolved with words, he resolves it with the Crozius that sits across his knees and has not been cleaned since Verund. And the conversation ends. He has been quiet recently, quieter than usual, which for Skelvorn is a meaningful distinction because his usual state is already somewhere between taciturn and geological. The last campaign was Dolvenath, a civilized world in the trailing reach of a subsector whose imperial garrison had been drawn down for a crusade mustering 6 systems rimward. We hit the capital hive at dawn with a full drop, brothers and mortal auxiliaries together, 89 brothers in the first wave, and the rest holding the ship against a counterattack that never came because the garrison was 6 conscript companies and a PDF brigade that had not fired a weapon in earnest in 30 years. The campaign lasted 9 days. 9 days from insertion to the last organized resistance, and in those 9 days we killed approximately 40,000 people and lost 2 brothers and 11 mortal auxiliaries, and took the hive's tithe stores and its armory and its water reclamation plant's control systems, and 1,400 prisoners, of whom 1,106 survived the journey to the Brenkeld in the hold of the transport shuttles, and the whole operation was conducted with the precision and efficiency that 8 centuries of doing this kind of work produces. And it was the cleanest campaign I have fought since the fall, and it was wrong. I do not mean morally wrong. I mean it was wrong the way a meal can be wrong, technically adequate, nutritionally sufficient, and completely without flavor. We killed 40,000 people in 9 days, and I felt nothing. Not rage, not exultation, not the hot singing pressure behind the eyes that tells you the god is close, and his hand is on the back of your neck, and the blood you are spilling is landing on brass and burning the way blood is supposed to burn when it is offered correctly. I felt the mechanics of killing. I felt muscle and bone and the chain axe doing what the chain axe does, and the bodies falling the way bodies fall, and the skull coming free. The way a skull comes free when you know exactly where to place the blade, and I felt all of this the way a production line feels at the 100th hour, competently, efficiently, and without the slightest trace of the thing that is supposed to make it matter. I did not discuss this with anyone. A brother who admits the fire has gone thin is a brother who has announced his own weakness. And weakness in a Khorne warband is an invitation that does not need to be delivered twice. But I watched the others during those 9 days, and I watched them after, during the transit from Dolvanath to whatever patch of empty void we are occupying now. And what I saw in some of them was what I was feeling in myself, which was the absence of the thing that had always been there, and the presence of something in its place that I did not have a name for, and did not want one. That was 6 weeks ago. The lull has been running since Dolvanath, and there is no end in sight. Skelvorn has not named a target. The augurs have not identified a prospect. The Brenkeld is sitting in the gravitational shadow of a dead brown dwarf in a system with no designation and no value and no reason for anyone to come here. And the engines are idling at station-keeping power, and the yard is running, and the captive pens are depleting at their usual rate, and the whole vast organism of the ship is ticking over the way it always ticks over during a lull, and nothing is wrong, and everything is wrong, and I have been standing in the yard for 6 weeks, hosing the same deck and racking the same skulls, and pairing the same brothers, and watching the same fights, and feeling the same nothing, and the nothing is getting louder. I went to see Grisok this morning. After Reuven's skull was on the rack and the yard was clean, I walked down 3 decks and aft through the enginarium, access corridor to the section of the ship that Grisok has claimed as his own, and I use the word claimed with precision because what Grisok has done to the portside enginarium annex is not habitation, it is annexation. The original layout of the space is no longer visible. The walls are hung with cable and conduit and sections of dismantled machinery that Grisok has stripped from other parts of the ship and reassembled here in configurations that obey a logic I have never been able to follow and have stopped trying to follow, because Grisok's logic runs on an operating system that diverged from anything I would recognize as thought approximately 2 centuries ago, and the divergence has been accelerating. He is not a warpsmith in the formal sense. He never held that title. Before the fall, he was a tech marine of the 5th degree, which is a respectable attainment in any chapter. And in the years since the fall, he has continued the work he was trained for by the Mechanicus, with the single modification that he no longer operates within the constraints the Mechanicus imposed, and the removal of those constraints has produced results that are difficult to look at and impossible to argue with. The ship is still flying. The reactors are still burning. The Geller field is still holding. If the price of those 3 things is that his section sounds like something breathing when you press an ear to the bulkhead, that is a price I pay without investigating what is doing the breathing. I found him at his bench, which is a slab of hull plating balanced on 2 reactor coolant drums, working on a chain axe that was not his and not anyone else's that I recognized. The teeth were wrong. They were not standard Astartes teeth. They were longer, curved slightly inward, and the metal had a reddish tint that was not rust and not paint and not anything I could identify from the doorway. I asked him whose axe it was. Not an axe yet, he said, becoming an axe. said in the tone a man uses about a fruit that is ripening. I did not press the matter because I had not come about the axe, and because pressing Grisic on the subject of his work produces answers that arrive in an order he finds logical, and I find deeply unpleasant. The engines were fine, the field was fine. Transit window, 6 hours if Skelvorn gave the order. I asked him whether anything had changed since Dolvenath, anything mechanical, anything in the ship's systems, anything in the reactor's output or the field's integrity or the navigational augurs or any of the 1,000 subsystems that keep a battle barge operational in the void. He stopped working on the axe that was becoming an axe, and he looked at me, and his eyes are not the same color they were when I knew him as a tech marine, and I have learned not to look directly into them for longer than a sentence or two, and he said, "No, nothing has changed. The ship is the same ship it was before Dolvenath." Then he went back to work, and I stood in his doorway for another 30 seconds, listening to the bulkhead breathe, and then I left. The shrine is on the deck above the yard. It occupies what was once the Brenkeld's primary chapel, a vaulted space with load-bearing columns and a ceiling high enough that a thunderhawk could nearly fit inside it, and the chapel was consecrated to the Emperor when the ship was launched, and the Aquilus were on the walls when we took it, and they are not on the walls now, and what is on the walls now is skulls. The skulls cover the walls from deck to ceiling. They are mounted on iron spikes, driven into the hull plating at regular intervals by the first yardsman, whose name I do not know because the first yardsman's skull is on the wall with the others, and nobody thought to record which one it is. The arrangement follows a pattern that I believe was intentional when it was begun, and has long since outgrown whatever the intention was. The oldest skulls, at the base of the walls, are dark and cracked and in many cases partially fused to the iron that holds them, and the bone has taken on the color of the metal around it, a deep reddish-brown that is not blood and not rust, but something between the two that happens when bone and iron and age occupy the same space for long enough. The newest skulls, at the top of the walls where the mortal thralls climb on ladders to place them, are still pale. Some of them are from Dolvenath. Some of them are from the yard. The distinction does not matter to the shrine. In the center of the chamber, on a dais that Skelvorn had built from the melted-down remnants of the chapel's original altar furnishings, is the brass. I call it the brass because that is what everyone aboard calls it, and the word is accurate in the way that calling an ocean wet is accurate, technically correct, and completely insufficient. The brass is a throne. It is not Skelvorn's throne. Skelvorn sits in the strategium, in the dead chapter master's chair, and has never sat here. The brass belongs to the god. It is made from weapons and armor that have been melted and reforged, not by Grisic, who refuses to touch it, but by the mortal smiths who serve the shrine under the direction of a cult priestess named Thera, who has been aboard the Brenkeld longer than any other mortal, and whose age I cannot reliably estimate because the warp does things to flesh that do not follow the arithmetic that flesh is supposed to obey. The brass was started in the 1st century after the fall, and it has been added to after every campaign since, and it is now taller than an Astartes in full plate and twice as wide, and the seat of it faces the entrance so that anyone who enters the shrine walks toward it, and the weight of it has required structural reinforcement of the deck below, and the heat of it, and this is the part that matters, the heat of it is how you know. The brass radiates. Not heat in the physical sense, not thermal energy that a scanner would register, but a warmth that sits in a register below temperature and above nothing. When the shrine is active, when the god's attention is on us, the brass is warm the way a living body is warm. You can feel it from the doorway. You can feel it through ceramite gauntlets if you place your hand on the arm of the throne, which is a thing I have done exactly once in my life, and will not do again, because what I felt through the gauntlet was not temperature, but attention. And the attention of a god is not a thing that scales to human senses. The warmth tells you he is watching. The warmth tells you the blood is landing where it is supposed to land, and the skulls are going where they are supposed to go. And the work of the war band is being received by the entity for whom the work is performed. The brass was cold this morning. I went to the shrine after Grisok because I go to the shrine after Grisik every morning, and the order of the circuit has not changed in decades. And the circuit is yard, engineerium, shrine, mortal decks, hall, and the circuit takes approximately 4 hours depending on what I find at each station and how long the conversations take. I walked through the shrine door and I felt nothing. Not the usual warmth, not the usual pressure of something vast and ancient and hungry pressing against the far side of reality like a face against glass. Nothing. I walked to the brass and I stood in front of it, and I waited, the way you wait for a signal to arrive through atmospheric interference, and the signal did not arrive. I placed my hand on the arm of the throne, which I said I would not do again, and which I did anyway, because the alternative was to walk out of that room not knowing, and I felt metal, cold metal, the same temperature as the bulkhead behind it, and the deck below it, and the air around it. The brass was a piece of furniture. The brass was dead. I checked the dais mountings before I left. That is not my remit, and never has been, and I checked them because a man who has just found out the room is wrong will look for something in it he can still measure. I stood there for a long time. I do not know how long, because time in the shrine does not behave reliably, even when the god is present. And when the god is absent, it behaves however it likes. I stood there and I looked at the skulls on the walls, and they looked back at me with the same empty sockets they have always had, except that the emptiness was different now. An inhabited skull has a quality to it that an uninhabited skull does not. And I cannot describe the quality because the quality exists in a register that language does not reach. But I have spent 4 centuries in the presence of consecrated bone, and I know the difference the way a man who lives by the sea knows the difference between water that is moving and water that is still. The water was still. I left the shrine and I did not tell anyone what I had found, because there was nobody aboard who needed to hear it from me. The brothers who go to the shrine regularly, and not all of them do, because Khornite devotion is expressed in blood rather than in attendance, would feel the absence on their own, in their own time, through their own hands. The brothers who do not go to the shrine would feel it in a different way, through the thinning of the fire that I had already noticed in myself and in others, through the growing gap between what the killing was supposed to feel like and what the killing actually felt like, through the slow, awful realization that the furnace in the chest was running on fumes, and the fuel line had been cut, and nobody could say when or by whom or why, down to the mortal decks next. The mortal decks occupy the lower third of the ship's habitable volume, a labyrinth of compartments and corridors and serviceways that were designed for an imperial crew of 6,000, and now hold 2,400 souls in conditions that are not the worst I have seen aboard a vessel, but are not far from it. The air is bad. The lighting is intermittent. The water is recycled from the ship's own systems and has a taste that no amount of filtration has been able to remove, and that the mortals have stopped noticing because the alternative to drinking it is dying, and dying without purpose is not permitted aboard the Brenkeld, and Skelvorn's definition of purpose is narrow enough that dying of thirst does not qualify. The mortal decks are run by Kellak, which is a statement that requires some context because Kellic is the youngest brother in the war band, and the assignment of the mortal decks to the youngest brother is not an accident, and it is not a punishment, and it is a thing that Skelvorn does for reasons that I understand and do not entirely agree with. Kellic has been with us for 67 years. He was not born to the Stenvault. He was born to nobody. He was a feral world aspirant from a world whose name he does not use, processed through the remnants of the chapter's apothecarium, by methods that I observed and do not approve of and cannot improve upon, because the gene seed is what the gene seed is, and there is no fixing it from here. A chapter grows its own. 2 glands go into a brother at implantation and are cut back out of him later, one at 5 years, one at 10, and both again off his corpse if the reductor reaches him before the heat does. And that harvest is the entire supply forever, with nothing coming in from outside and nothing going out. Before the fall, the surplus went to Terra as tithe, and Terra's people looked at it and told us what was drifting. Nobody has looked at ours in 819 years. The stock has been folded back into itself across 30 generations with no eye on it but our own. And it has been sitting inside a hull that crosses the warp, and warp exposure does to a gene line exactly what you would expect it to do. Add to that the brothers we lose before the second harvest, which on the current gradient is most of them, and the fact that the last brother trained as an apothecary died on Thresengard, and what we have now is a serf cadre working from a manual and Grissok supervising the machines. The material would be condemned on sight by any loyalist chapter, and the ones performing the implantation cannot read most of what they are following. The rejection rate is appalling. 7 in every 8 aspirants die during the process, and of the survivors, perhaps half live through their first campaign, and of those, perhaps half again are still recognizably themselves after a decade. Kellic survived. He survived the process and the first campaign and the second and the third, and he is still recognizably himself, angry and violent and devoted, and exactly the kind of instrument the blood god favors. He is also capable of managing 2,400 mortals without killing them all in the first week. That is why Skelvorn gives him the job. The ability to stand in a room full of things you want to kill and not kill them is a capability the warband needs and does not have in abundance. And Skelvorn recognizes utility the way a blade recognizes a whetstone, by the angle of contact and nothing else. I found Kellic on the middle gallery of the main mortal berthing block, standing at the rail overlooking the lower tier where the ship-borne families keep their bunks and their cooking fires and their small, miserable lives. He was watching a fight, not one of mine, not a yard fight. A mortal fight, 2 men going at each other with lengths of pipe over something I neither asked about nor cared about, while a ring of onlookers maintained the kind of careful distance that people maintain when they know the fight could expand to include anyone who stands too close. Kellic was watching with the expression he always wears when observing mortals, which is the expression of a man looking at an animal that is doing something he recognizes without understanding why the animal does it at such a reduced scale. The 2 men were bleeding. Neither was winning. The pipe lengths were bent from impact, and the fight was degenerating into grappling, which is where mortal fights go when the weapons become unreliable, and the grappling was ugly and close and entirely without technique. And Kellic watched it the way I watch the morning session in the yard, which is to say with professional tolerance and personal contempt. We were down to 409 from the Dolvenath intake, with the rest consumed by the yard or by attrition, or by the specific requirements of individual brothers, who have standing arrangements with the pens that I facilitate and do not supervise. 409 captives for a lull that showed no sign of ending, with the yard consuming between 3 and 7 per week, depending on the evening schedule, meant a supply horizon of roughly 14 weeks at the current rate of use. This was not an emergency. This was not even a concern in the normal course of things, because a lull of 14 weeks is at the long end of what we have experienced, but not beyond it. And in any case, the captive stock is supplemented by the mortal population itself when necessary. Volunteers from the cult, or mortals judged surplus to the crew requirement, or mortals who have committed infractions that Kellogg resolves by transferring them to the pens rather than by killing them on the spot, which is his preferred method, but which wastes a body that could otherwise serve a purpose in the yard. I told him the numbers because the numbers are part of my circuit, and the circuit requires me to tell him, and he listened and nodded and said nothing. And I asked him whether he had noticed anything different about the brothers who came to the mortal decks for their personal arrangements. And he looked at me with the same look I have been getting from everyone I have asked this question of, which is the look of a man who has noticed exactly what I have noticed and does not want to be the first one to say it out loud. I will say it then, because somebody has to, and the yardsman is the one whose job it is to say the things that the yard reveals. And the yard has been revealing this for 6 weeks, and I have been hosing it away with the blood every morning, and it comes back every evening. And the thing is this: the fire is going out. Not in me, not in Kellogg, not in any one brother. In all of us. In the whole warband, like a furnace whose fuel has been cut at the source. The killing at Dol Van Nath tasted like nothing because it cost us nothing. 40,000 people who could not fight back, who did not have the weapons or the training or the will to stand against a single Astartes, let alone 160. And the blood we took from them reached the god the way all blood reaches the god. Khorne does not refuse an offering. Every drop that falls lands in the same ocean regardless of how it was drawn. But blood that costs nothing earns nothing, and the warmth on the brass is not payment for volume. It is recognition of worth, and the worth is in the risk. And there was no risk at Dol Vanath, and there has been no risk for a long time. There is a thing the chaplains used to tell us before the fall, when the enemy was a label, and the thing it served was an abstraction, and neither of them had anything to do with me. They said the blood god takes the blood of the warrior, and the blood of the sacrifice, and the blood of the infant, and the blood of the king, and does not distinguish between them at the level of the ocean. All blood is blood, all skulls are skulls. But the god's attention, the fire behind the eyes, the heat on the brass, the thing that turns a man holding an axe into something more than a man holding an axe, that is not given for volume. That is given for what the blood costs, the one who spills it. A warrior who risks his own skull to take another skull is performing an act the god watches. A warrior who harvests skulls from men who cannot lift a weapon is performing an act the god does not need to watch, because the outcome was never in question. And a god who already knows the outcome has no reason to be present. We have been performing acts the god does not need to watch for a long time, not just Dol Vanath. Dol Vanath was the latest and the most complete expression of what we have been becoming, but the trajectory started before that. The campaign before Dol Vanath was a mining colony with a militia of 800 men armed with autoguns and determination, and nothing else. The campaign before that was a tithe convoy, 3 transports, and an escort frigate whose crews surrendered when they saw what was boarding them. The campaign before that was another colony, another militia, another population that fought because there was nowhere to run and died because there was nothing else to do. I could trace the line through decades of campaigns and show you the gradient, the slow descent from wars that tested us to engagements that did not, from enemies who could hurt us to enemies who could only die in front of us, from blood that cost us broken bones and shattered blades to blood that cost us nothing but the time it took to swing. And the gradient is unmistakable once you see it, and I did not see it until the brass went cold, and the brass went cold because we fell below the line where the god's attention reaches. We did not offend Khorne. That would require us to matter enough to offend. We became uninteresting. A war band that takes a colony of 40,000 unresisting civilians is not a war band the blood god needs to watch. It runs, it produces output, the output enters the system, and nobody stands over it because nobody needs to. We became a machine. We produced skulls the way a factory produces its product, and the product went where the product goes, and the god received it the way he receives everything, which is automatically and without the personal attention that turns a killing into a communion. The brass went cold because the warmth was never a reward for killing. The warmth was the god leaning forward. And you do not make a god lean forward by doing a thing that any fool with an axe and an unarmed room could do. That is the truth. That is what the cold brass means. And I did not tell anyone because I did not need to, because the brothers who have been in the war band long enough to remember what the fire felt like when it was fed properly already know. And the brothers who have not been in the war band that long do not have the frame of reference to understand what they are missing. And Kellak is one of the second kind, and Moldrin is one of the first, and neither of them wants to discuss it, and neither of them has to, because the Yard is telling the story for them every day. The fights have changed. I said the morning session was raw and ugly, and I said the evening session was mine, and both of those things are still true. But the quality of both has shifted in a direction I do not like and cannot correct with scheduling. The morning fights are getting longer. A bout that should last 3 or 4 minutes is running 8 or 9, and the extra time is not skill time, it is hesitation time. Brothers circling each other, feinting, resetting, doing everything except committing to the stroke that will end it. Because the stroke that ends it is the stroke that sends them back to the silence, and the silence is what they are trying to avoid. They are fighting to stay in the fight, not to win it. And the evening fights are getting lethal. Brothers who fought to submission under my terms for decades are now pushing past the point where submission is offered, and the brother who should go down is not going down because going down means leaving the Yard. And the brother who should accept the submission is not accepting it, because accepting it means having nothing left to do. And the result is that my Yard, my controlled valve, my mechanism for bleeding off the pressure without losing the patient, is becoming the thing it was designed to prevent. The morning session last week produced 3 deaths in 5 bouts. The evening session produced 2. That is a rate that will eat the warband inside a year, and Skelvorn has said nothing about it, and his silence is the loudest thing aboard this ship. The hall was last on the circuit. The lumens were at their brightest, and the corridors of the upper decks were as well lit as they ever get. And I walked through those corridors, and I passed brothers in them, and they passed me, and nobody spoke. And the silence between us was not the comfortable silence of men who do not need words, but the other kind, the kind that has teeth in it, the kind where every man is aware of every other man's weapon, and the distance between his hand and his weapon, and the calculations are running continuously in the part of the brain that the catalepsian node never shuts down. And the calculations are about whether the brother walking toward you is going to keep walking, or whether this is the moment when the corridor becomes a yard, and the yard does not have a yardsman. Skelvorn was in the throne. He is always in the throne during a lull, because the throne is where he receives the reports, and the reports are the structure that the lull has, and without the structure the lull is just void. and Skelvorn knows what void does to his brothers better than anyone aboard, because Skelvorn is the one who built the structure in the first place, in the first century after the fall, when the warband lost more than half its strength in a single lull, because nobody had thought to give the fire anywhere to go. Skelvorn built the yard, not the physical space. The yardsman before me was the one who found the cargo bay and cleared it and drove the first spikes into the wall for the skulls. But the institution, the schedule, the terms, the role, the entire architecture of managed violence that has kept the Sten Vault alive for 8 centuries while other Khornite warbands burned themselves to the waterline in 1/10 of that time. Skelvorn built it because Skelvorn understood, earlier than anyone else, that Khorne does not care whether you survive. Khorne cares whether you bleed. And a warband that tears itself apart produces a great deal of blood in a very short time and then produces nothing, and nothing is the thing the blood god will not forgive. He was sitting in the dark. The lumens in the hall were off. I could see him by the glow of the trophy racks, which are lit by a strip of chem lumens that Grisic installed along the base of each rack, because trophies that cannot be seen serve no function, and the light from below cast his face in a way that made the scars look deeper than they are, and the eye sockets look empty. And for a moment, I thought I was looking at a skull, not a face. And the difference between the two was not as large as it should have been. The Crozius was across his knees. It is always across his knees. I have never seen him rack it or holster it or set it anywhere that is not his lap. The Crozius is not a tool he uses. The Crozius is the argument that settles every other argument. And an argument you might need at any second is an argument you keep where your hands are. I gave him the yard report. 4 bouts in the morning, 3 deaths. Reuven, a brother named Hastrek, whose service I do not recall because his service was brief and unremarkable, and a mortal volunteer from the cult who had requested the honor of facing a brother in single combat, and whose request I had granted because denying a cult volunteer produces more administrative problems than losing one produces logistical ones. Theara writes letters when she is denied. I have received 4 in 4 centuries and read 1. 2 bouts scheduled for the evening, both brother to brother, terms set at submission with a captive penalty, which means the loser fights a captive immediately after the bout and the winner watches, and this format usually keeps the evening deaths to 0, because the loser's anger at losing is redirected toward the captive instead of toward the brother who beat him, and the captive absorbs the kill that would otherwise land on a brother the warband cannot afford to lose. I gave him the numbers. I gave him the stock report. I gave him the shrine report, which was the part where I said nothing about the brass, because the brass was not in the report, and not in my remit, and not a subject I was prepared to raise in a room where the only light came from below, and the man in the chair had not moved since I entered. He listened. He did not speak for a long time. The Crozius did not move on his knees. I could hear the mortal decks working under the floor, the breathing and movement baseline that the ship produces when 2,400 humans go about their business in the belly of a vessel that was not built for them. And I could hear the reactors hum, and I could hear Skelvorn breathing, which was the thing that told me he was still alive rather than something that had died in a chair and remained upright through the rigidity of the armor. And his breathing was slow, slower than an Astartes at rest, slow enough that each exhalation lasted 5 or 6 seconds, and the interval between breaths was long enough to make me wonder whether the next one was coming. Then he asked me one question, which was whether the shrine was in good order. I said the rack was maintained and the spikes were sound, and the eastern wall needed reseating in the spring. All of that was true. None of it answered what he had asked. Both of us knew that while I was saying it. Then he lifted the Crozius from his knees and set it against the armrest of the throne, which I had never seen him do before in 8 centuries, and I understood that I was dismissed, and I left. The Crozius made sense to me only when the hall filled. He set it down in front of a brother who had just lied to him. Not a lie he could prove, and not one he intended to punish. He set the weapon aside instead, which is the only way that man has ever had of saying a thing without saying it, and what it said was that he did not need it, and had not needed it, and had known about the brass before I came through the door. He had been to the shrine himself, or he had reached it some other way. He had already given Grisic the order. My report was received the way a form already actioned gets received, and the one piece of information I was withholding as though it were mine to withhold had been his for longer than it had been mine. I had carried that thing all day, thinking it was too heavy to hand over, and the man I was protecting from it had put it down before I picked it up. 6 weeks of lull, and everyone in it doing the same, holding a peace privately, waiting for somebody else to speak first. The galley was next, because the body requires what the body requires. Eating is the wrong word for what an Astartes does with nutrition. I use it anyway. The galley is a compartment on the middeck between the yard and the armory, converted from a munitions loading bay, and the conversion consists of a steel bench and a shelf, and access to whatever Grisic's mortal serfs have prepared from the ship's stores. The stores are campaign salvage, ration packs from 4 Imperial worlds in the last decade, stacked in crates with the Aquila still stamped on the lids, because nobody cares enough about the Aquila to scratch it off, and the ration pack does not taste better or worse with the symbol intact. 8 centuries at war with the Imperium, and we are still eating its food. Nobody aboard finds this worth remarking on. The Preomnor processes nearly anything. Raw grain, fiber blocks, nutrient paste, meat of any provenance, and any age. I ate alone. A fiber block and a slab of something the mortal cooks call gray, which is a protein preparation made from rendered fat and connective tissue cooked at a temperature high enough to kill whatever was causing it to turn and pressed into slabs that have the color and texture of hull sealant, and a taste that exists somewhere between nothing and slightly less than nothing. The Omophagia does not engage with cooked food. The Omophagia engages with raw tissue, and when it engages, it provides information: the health of the organism, the chemical state of its muscles, sometimes a fragmentary sensory impression that flickers through the consumer's awareness like a frame from somebody else's life. I have consumed raw flesh. Every brother has. And the Omophagia delivers the same thing every time, which is fear. Every living thing I have consumed was afraid when it died, and the fear arrives as a cold metallic surge at the base of the skull that lasts approximately 4 seconds and then dissipates. And after 4 centuries, the surge has become merely texture, the way salt is texture. And it tells me nothing I did not already know about what it feels like to be the last thing another creature sees. The gray does not provide a surge. The gray provides calories. I ate it and sat on the bench and listened to the ship, because the ship sounds different when you are sitting still with nothing to do, and your purpose for the next 3 hours is to exist in the interval between the end of the circuit and the beginning of the evening session, and in that interval the ship speaks to you if you let it. The Brenkeld has a voice. Not a literal voice. The Brenkeld's voice is the aggregate of every system running simultaneously. The reactor's basso, the life support's mid-register hiss, the structural stress of a hull under constant internal pressure, the coolant circulation, the lumens, the distant rhythmic thump of the mortal decks that changes pitch depending on the population's mood. During a campaign, the voice is drowned by engines and weapons and brothers. During a lull, the voice is all there is, and you learn it the way a man who lives alone in a house learns the sounds the house makes at night. The creak that means the temperature dropped, the rattle that means the wind shifted, the silence that means something stopped that should not have stopped. I know which sounds are normal and which mean I should mention something to Grisick, and which mean I should not because the something is coming from his section, and mentioning it would require an explanation I do not want. The ship breathes. The ship settles. The ship complains about the cold the way old metal complains about the cold, by contracting at the joints and producing a periodic clicking that runs along the corridor ceilings like something walking overhead. And the clicking is not something walking overhead, and the mortal crew flinch anyway, because knowledge and instinct are not the same system, and the instinct does not listen to briefings. My maintenance alcove sits off the yard, close enough that I can hear the drainage pump cycling from the bench. My chain axe is not the axe I carried as third captain. That axe was destroyed in the boarding action against the Black Templars, split at the housing by a power sword blow, that I survived because the brother wielding the sword overcommitted and left his throat exposed, and the axe was the price of the half-second, and I have never regretted the exchange. The axe I carry now was made by Grisick from salvaged components, a housing from one weapon, a motor from another, teeth from a third, and a handle shaped from structural bracing on a lath he built from parts of a rhino we lost in a campaign I do not remember. It does not have a name. Brothers who name weapons are brothers who believe the weapon has a spirit. I do not believe the weapon has a spirit, and if Grisick tells me otherwise, I will not argue with him, but I will continue not believing. I cleaned the axe and tested the activation switch and checked the motor housing, and the axe was clean and ready, and the readiness is the point, not the use. I serviced the armor, the joint articulations, a failing gasket on the left vambrace I had been carrying a replacement for in my kit for 3 years, the reactor output, the power routing, the auto-senses. Every brother services his own plate. Skelvorn does not permit mortal hands on Astartes' armor, and the reasoning is sound. A mortal who knows where the seals are weakest is a mortal who can share that knowledge with someone who would like to put a blade through the seal while you are half sleeping. I recorded the results in a log I keep scratched into the wall of the alcove in marks only I can read, and the log goes back 312 years, and the wall is running out of space. Afternoon. The corridor was empty. The lumens were at standard output, a yellow-gray that makes everything look underwater and makes every brother who walks through it look like a corpse in armor. Through Moldrin's armory hatch, I could hear the sound of a whetstone on metal, which meant Moldrin was sharpening something, which meant he was performing the only act of care he is capable of. He has been sharpening the same collection of blades for centuries, and the blades reached their optimal edge 200 years ago, and what Moldrin is sharpening is not the blade, but the hour. The hour will not get sharper either, but the attempt occupies the hands, and hands that are occupied with a whetstone are hands that are not occupied with a brother's throat. I passed cells. Most brothers have cells, 3 meters by 2, bare metal, a weapon rack, a standing frame that serves the function a bed would serve for a mortal, except that the frame is vertical, because an Astartes in half-sleep does not need to lie down, and the standing position keeps combat readiness at a level a prone position does not. Some brothers close their cells during a lull, some leave them open. The open ones are the brothers who are past caring about privacy, and the closed ones are the brothers who are past caring about company. And the distinction shifts over the course of a lull in a pattern I have observed but cannot predict. The mortal decks pulled me back down. Not as part of the circuit. The circuit was done. The mortal decks are the part of the ship where things are still happening when the Astartes decks have gone quiet. And the happening is a sound I find useful during the long afternoon, the closest thing to quiet that does not feel like emptiness. The crew needs feeding, the systems need monitoring, the children need minding, the cult needs servicing, and all of these things continue during a lull at the same pace as during a campaign, because the mortal population does not have the luxury of pausing. A brother can stand in a corridor for 3 hours, and the nothing will not kill him. A mortal who stands still for 3 hours is a mortal who is not maintaining the air scrubbers, or the water recyclers, or the food preparation, or the 1,000 other functions that keep 2,400 human bodies alive inside a hull that was designed for their presence, but not for their comfort. Thera was conducting a rite on the lower gallery. She stopped it early. The cultists stayed kneeling a long moment after she had gone quiet, which is how I knew something had not been finished. She came along the gallery afterwards and stood 2 meters from me, which no mortal aboard does, and told me the offering had not been accepted for 11 days. She did not say by whom. She did not use the god's name, which she never does, and she did not say cold, and she has never had her bare hand on that metal in her life. What she said was that the rags were coming back the same weight as they went in. That is her whole instrument. 4 centuries of taking blood up to the shrine and bringing the cloth back down, and somewhere in that she has learned to weigh it in her hands, and she has an idea about what the weight means that is almost certainly nonsense, and is also the only independent confirmation I have received from anyone aboard this ship. I told her to continue the rites on schedule. She said she intended to. Then she went back down to her people, and I stood on that gallery, understanding that the oldest mortal aboard the Brenkeld had worked out that something was wrong 11 days before I put my hand on the throne, and had said nothing to anybody, for the same reason I had said nothing to anybody. The cult gathers twice during a lull cycle, timed to the shift changes that Kelek imposed on the mortal work crews, because Thera is practical about her devotion and schedules her rites to capture the largest audience at the transition between shifts. The rite is not elaborate. Thera stands at a makeshift altar, a welded steel frame draped with a cloth that was once red and is now a color that red becomes after decades of proximity to the kind of substances that accumulate on a cloth used for blood offerings. And she speaks in something that has the shape of a language without any of the properties of one, and I suspect she invented it because Thyera is older than anyone's ability to verify her credentials, and the cult she runs answers to no authority above her, except Skelvorn. The mortals kneel. Some cut their palms with small knives and let the blood fall on the deck. And the blood is collected on rags by younger cultists, and the rags are taken to the shrine, and the blood on the rags is added to the brass during Thyera's weekly consecration, and the brass takes the mortal blood the way it takes everything else, which is without visible reaction, and without the warmth that it gives when the blood comes from a brother's kill, and the absence of that reaction has never seemed to trouble Thera, and I have not told her about the difference. It would not help her, and it would not help me. The children watched. There are children on the Brenkeld, perhaps 100, infants to adolescents approaching the age where they will be assessed for crew assignment or cult induction, or, in rare cases, the aspirant process that has produced brothers like Kelloch at a cost of 7 failures for every success. They are born aboard, they live aboard. Most will die aboard. They know the Brenkeld by smell and sound and the temperature of the deck under bare feet, and they have learned the bell schedule better than their parents, because a child's survival depends on knowing when the brothers are in the yard and when they are in the corridors, And a child in a corridor at the wrong time is a child who has made the last mistake available to children aboard this ship. They watched Thera's right with the faces children have when they are watching something they have seen before and do not understand and have stopped asking about because the answers are not intended for them. The answers Thera gives are about blood and devotion and the gods' hunger. The children absorb them whole, without the filter an adult would bring. The adults who were once those children are the cultists kneeling at the altar now, and the cycle requires no external maintenance. I stood on the upper gallery and watched the rite, and watched the children watching the rite, and I thought about the brass, which was cold, and the blood on the rags, which would be taken to the brass, and the brass would take the blood and nothing would happen. And Thera would not notice because she has never touched the brass with her bare hands, and the cultists would not notice because they do not know there is a thing to notice, and the children would not notice because they do not know there is a world outside this ship in which a warrior kills something that can kill him back, and the killing produces a sound the god can hear, and the sound is worth hearing, and the silence when the sound stops is what I have been carrying since this morning. I was in the yard doing the afternoon cleaning, hosing the deck, checking drainage, replacing a spike on the eastern wall, when the sound hit the ship. Grisok struck the main superstructure with something I never identified. The sound was heavy and resonant, a tone that ran through the Brentkeld from keel to prow, a deep harmonic that I felt in the soles of my boots and in the ceramite plating across my chest, and in the marrow of the bones beneath the ceramite. The sound was Threskeld. I had not heard it in 14 years, and the time before that was 2 centuries further back, and the word is older than the warband, older than the fall, older than the chapter itself. On Thresengard, the world where the Stenvault was founded, a world that no longer exists because the Imperium destroyed the fortress monastery by orbital bombardment after our fall. The vault beneath the mountain had a property. When you struck the floor with the flat of a blade, the granite produced a harmonic that resonated in the chest the way a bell resonates in the air. And the chaplains used that sound as a call to assembly, and it meant one thing. It meant war. Not a campaign, not a deployment. Threskeld meant something was coming that required everything the chapter had and might take more than it could afford, and the only appropriate response was to come to the vault and listen to the Lord tell you what you were going to die fighting. The sound Grisok struck from the hull was not the vault's sound. Granite and hull alloy sing in different registers, but every brother who had heard the last Threskeld understood the intent, and every brother who had not understood it by watching those who had, because 163 men stopping what they are doing at the same instant and moving in the same direction is not a thing that requires explanation. The hall filled. The hall has never held every brother at once. During a campaign briefing, it holds perhaps 40. During a lull, it holds 6 or 7. This was the full warband. 163 brothers in power armor, standing in a room that could hold perhaps 200 if none of them needed to draw a weapon. And the room was hot with reactor cores and muscle fiber bundles, and the low-grade metabolic fury that an Astartes body generates continuously. And the smell was ceramite and oil and old blood, and the particular dry metallic scent that Mark IV plate produces when the seals have not been replaced in 3 centuries. Below us, the cult's chanting ran through the deck plate like a pulse, and the mortals and the children were down there living the lives the ship allows, and we were up here being told what we were going to die fighting. Skelvorn stood. He does not stand often during a lull. Standing is a combat posture, a deliberate transition from the passive state of the throne to the active state of a man who intends to do something that requires his feet. He told us about Helvrant. Helvrant is a fortress world 5 weeks from our current position, on the far side of a warp corridor that Grisik says is stable enough for a crossing and narrow enough that the transit should be shorter than the distance suggests, though his use of the word should carry a weight that the word does not normally bear. Helvrant has a garrison, not a PDF, not a militia. A full Astra Militarum regiment, the Helvrant 16th Fortress Infantry, 2,300 soldiers dug into a defensive perimeter that has been maintained and improved for 50 years against a greenskin incursion on the neighboring world, with prepared positions and pre-sighted fire zones and bunker complexes and armor and artillery, and a command structure that has been running combat rotations long enough that the garrison troops know what they are doing. Skelvorn said this with the flatness he applies to everything, and in the flatness was the point. This was not Dolvanath. This was not a colony or a convoy or a population that would kneel. This was a fortification defended by soldiers who would fight because fighting is what they were built to do, and the walls were thick and the guns were real. He gave us the source before he gave us the target, which is his practice and always has been. The transport we took off that convoy route had been running Munitorum consignments, and Grisok had spent the 6 weeks since pulling the manifests apart, because a garrison orders what a garrison is, and 50 years of standing orders for last gun packs and artillery propellant and bunker sealant and rations for 2,300 mouths describes a defensive establishment more precisely than any augur sweep could. That is where Helvrant came from. Not a vision, not a whisper. A cargo ledger. He gave us the rest of it plainly. Helvrant has orbital defense, 3 batteries on the southern continent, and a monitor squadron that runs a standing patrol, all of it 50 years old and maintained against greenskins who come in from the outer system in numbers, rather than in stealth. That means the Brenkeld cannot take a slow approach and cannot hold a high orbit. She translates close, absorbs whatever the batteries put into her ventral plating on the way down, and launches everything she has in one pass. Grisik said the keel would take it. He is also the man who told me that morning what the ventral plating still had left in it, and the 2 answers came out of the same mouth inside the same hour, and nobody in the hall asked him to reconcile them. As for the ground, the garrison numbers 2,300, and we are 163. The mortal auxiliaries do not enter that arithmetic. They will go down with us, and most of them will die in the first hour, and their function is to make the garrison spend ammunition on something that is not a brother. Counted honestly, the odds on Helvrant are 14-1, and the cartographic data showed a capital settlement built into a river valley with steep approaches and a citadel on high ground that would require a breach under fire across open terrain against emplaced heavy weapons, and the whole picture was a picture of the kind of war we used to fight and have not fought in a very long time and have forgotten how to want. He did not explain why. He did not say the brass is cold and the god cannot see us, and we need to make ourselves worth seeing again. He said the garrison strength and the fortification profile, and the transit time and the number of brothers who would drop in the first wave. He said the mortal auxiliaries would deploy at full strength. Every cultist, every thrall, every pressed rating who could hold a weapon, which was roughly 2,000 of the 2,400 aboard, with the remainder holding the ship on a skeleton watch, and if the ship was lost, the warband was lost with it. And that was a commitment he had not made since the Black Templars' boarding. He said these things, and then he stopped, and the silence was the densest silence I have experienced aboard the Brenkeld. 163 warriors processing the same piece of information, which was that Skelvorn was asking them to do a thing that many of them would not survive, and that the asking was not optional, and that the reason was not strategy or ambition or plunder, but something older and simpler, which was that he was asking them to be what they were. Not what they had become, what they were. Siege assault specialists, breakers of walls, the brothers who went in first and came out last, the work that made them, the work that unmade them, the work that turned them from servants of the Emperor into servants of the Blood God. And the work had been waiting for them, and they had been avoiding it, and the avoidance was the disease, and the cold, brass was the symptom, and Helvrant was the cure, and the cure might kill them. A brother named Ulbrich spoke before anyone moved. He has been with the war band 400 years, and he held a sergeancy before the fall and nothing since, and what he said was not a challenge in the formal sense, because he did not name a hand or draw anything. He asked who had chosen Dolvanath. He asked it in the flat register a man uses when he already knows the answer and wants the room to hear it said, and the room heard it, and the room understood what was underneath it, which was that the Lord who had walked them down the gradient for 8 decades was now proposing to walk them onto a fortress world, to correct it, and some of the correcting would be done with Ulbricht's body. In a war band that measures authority the way we measure it, that question is the opening move. What follows it is either a hand on a weapon or nothing. Skelvorn did not reach for the Crozius. It was on the armrest where he had left it, and he left it there. He said Dolvenath was his. He said it without weight, the way a man confirms a store's figure. Then he said that Ulbrich would have the first breach. Not the first wave, the first breach, the point of the first stack through the first wall of the outer works, which is the position that gets a brother killed more reliably than any other on a fortified world, and which every brother in that hall knew he was being handed as a gift with a blade in it. Ulbrich could refuse. Refusing would have been the end of him in a slower and less useful way. He said nothing at all, which is acceptance, and the matter was resolved, and Skelvorn had answered a challenge to his judgment by spending the challenger on the thing his judgment had produced. I have watched him do a version of that perhaps 20 times in 8 centuries, and it has never once failed, and it works because it is not a trick. Ulbrich will go first. If he lives, he will have taken an outer wall on a world that could kill him, which is more than any brother aboard has been given in decades. And nobody will ask about Dolvanath again. But Ulbrich had asked the right question. 400 years of stock reports means I am the only brother aboard who sees the whole ledger. The rejection rate I gave you earlier is not a figure of speech. 7 die on the table for everyone who walks off it. Half of those go down in their first campaign, and half of what remains is not recognizably itself inside a decade. There are perhaps 100 children on the mortal decks, and the ones who go to the table go rarely because Skelvorn will not spend a body on a process that fails 7 times in 8 unless there is a reason to. Set that against the yard, which takes 2 to 5 of us in a normal lull and has taken 7 in this one, and the lull is not over. Set it against Dolvanath, where we lost 2. Set it against the Black Templars, where we lost 41 in 9 hours, and it took a century and a half to get back to a strength that could hold a ship. We do not replace ourselves. We have not replaced ourselves since the fall. Every brother aboard the Brenkeld is a finite quantity, being drawn down at a rate that no arithmetic makes survivable, and the only variable Skelvorn has ever had any control over is how fast, so he slowed it. 80 years of it. A colony with a militia does not kill brothers. A convoy does not kill brothers. Dolvanath, with everything it had, cost us 2, and both of those were accidents rather than defenders. He was not avoiding war. He was rationing us. 80 years of protecting the number, and the number held, and the price of it was the gradient. and the gradient took us below the line where the god bothers to look. He traded the attention for the strength, and he did it knowing. And now he is spending it, all of it, in one pass, on a fortress world 14-1 against. With the ship committed and the mortals committed and the outcome genuinely unknown. Which means one of two things is true. Either the brass went cold enough that he judged the strength worthless without the gaze. A warband the god does not watch being merely a large number of men with axe drawing down toward nothing on a schedule, or he ran the same arithmetic I just ran and reached the end of it and understood that the number was going to 0, regardless, on a long, slow curve, in a yard, without a single skull worth the rack. I have watched him for 819 years, and I would put my hand on the second one. Moldrin moved next. He drew his chain axe and drove it into the deck plating blade first, and left it standing there vibrating, and the sound of a chain axe driven into hull plate is a sound I know better than any other, and the sound was a word, and the word was yes. 3 brothers did the same within seconds, then 5 more, then a ripple through the hall, and the deck was ringing with it. I did not drive my axe into the floor. The yardsman's job is not to answer the call. The yardsman's job is to prepare the warband to survive what the call demands. And I had a second thought standing there in that noise, which was that Grisic had told me that morning that nothing had changed since Dolvanath, and he had said it while holding 6 weeks of Munitorum manifests in his head and an order from Skelvorn in his hands, and he had not lied to me because I had asked him about the ship. The yard was waiting. I cleared the consecration rack and the drainage hose and the mortal access gate and everything that made the space a fighting pit, and I set it up as a kill room, a simulated fortification interior with barriers made from cargo containers and deck plating, crude geometry with wrong proportions that were nothing like what we would face on Helvrant, and none of that mattered because the exercise was not about the walls. The exercise was about remembering what it felt like to go through a wall with a brother on each side, and the certain knowledge that whatever was behind the wall had a weapon, and the skill to use it and the intention to kill you with it. And that knowledge, the knowledge that the next room might be the room where you die, is the thing that makes the blood worth the god's attention. And before I could run a single stack, I had to solve a problem I had not thought about in 200 years, which is that there is nobody to lead them. The Stenvault had sergeants. Ulbrek was one. There were 70 or 80 of them at the fall, and there is not one now, and nobody can name the year the last of them stopped being called that. It became unnecessary. A brother does not need a sergeant to walk into a hab block full of people who cannot fight back. He needs a direction and an hour. Command decayed the way everything here decayed, not by decision, but by 80 years of nobody's absence ever costing anything. Skelvorn named the first breach and no other position in the entire order of battle, not because he was being cryptic, because the first breach is the only appointment left that the warband still recognizes as an appointment. Everything below it is 162 brothers who will land on Helvrant and go forward until they stop, which is a formation the way a rock slide is a formation. So I built one. In a cargo bay out of shipping containers, at a few hours' notice, 7 centuries after the last brother qualified to do it properly stopped existing along with the mountain he was standing under. I took the 12 oldest, made them stack leaders, and told them so in front of the others. That is the entire ceremony available to me, and nobody objected. 400 years ago, that appointment came from a chapter master. Tonight it came from the man who runs the fighting pit, and not one of them noticed the difference. The brothers came. Not on a schedule, not on a roster. They came the way men come to something they have been starving for, armed and ready, and the fire in their eyes was different from the morning sessions. The morning fire was desperation, men trying to feel something and failing. This was purpose, not the old fire, not Khorne's attention, something more fundamental, something that predated the god and predated the fall, which was competence. We were soldiers, men trained to break fortifications, men who understood that a door is a kill zone, and a wall is cover, and a room is a tactical problem with a finite number of solutions, and the solution always involves speed and violence and the willingness to be the first man through the gap. I ran them through breaching drills for 6 hours. Room clearance, stacking, threshold discipline, the technical close quarters procedures, the Sten Vault codified in its first 3 centuries, and that we had not practiced since the fall. The brothers were clumsy. Moldrin tripped on a barricade during a stack drill and fell into the brother behind him, and the stack collapsed, and in a real breach all 3 of them would have died in the doorway. His face when he picked himself up was a face I had never seen on him. The face of a man who has discovered that the thing he does best is not the thing required. Individual lethality is not tactical competence. A man who can kill anything in front of him is not a man who can kill the right thing at the right moment in coordination with the men beside him. And the difference is the difference between a berserker and a siege assault brother. And we had been berserkers for so long we had forgotten the other thing existed. I went through them one at a time. Moldrin's footwork first, then his stack position, and he took the correction, which he has not done in 2 centuries. 2 centuries of telling that man about the teeth on his axe and getting nothing back, and I put a hand on his shoulder plate to move him 9 inches left in a doorway, and he moved 9 inches left and stayed there. 11 more runs. On the 9th, he stopped using the axe as a ram and started using it as an edge, which is the correction I have been failing to make since before the Black Templars came aboard. And he made it himself in a doorway, because the doorway required it, and I did not. The teeth will need less realignment on Helvrant. I corrected Kellak, who had never stacked with a breaching team in his life, because every enemy he had faced could be killed by walking toward it with an axe. Kellak learned faster than anyone else that evening because he did not have the old habits to unlearn, and I noted the speed and did not comment on it, because commenting on aptitude in the yard is marking a man, and a marked man draws challenges he may not be ready for. And I stood there with the ledger still open in my head from the hall and looked at Kellek, 67 years old, which means the apothecarium has not produced a survivor since before most of the mortals aboard were born, and understood that I was drilling the last thing this warband has produced for a doorway on a fortress world. There is an argument for holding him aboard. I am not making it to Skelvorn. A brother kept out of the breach to preserve the line is a brother the god does not see, and a warband that starts holding its best back is doing on a small scale exactly what it has spent 80 years doing on a large one. That is how the gradient started. Somebody made a sensible decision about preservation and then made it again. I drilled him at the 2nd position in the stack, which is where you put a man you want to survive the first room. That is the whole of what I did about it. Grisick came down at the 4th hour. He did not drill. He stood at the edge of the yard with the axe that had been becoming an axe, finished now, the reddish teeth catching the lumens, and he watched the stacks form and collapse and form again. And when I looked at him, he was holding the weapon out at arm's length, toward the kill room. Offered. The grip turned outward. Nobody took it. He put it against the wall and left it there and went back up to his section. And it was still there when I cleaned, and it is there now. And I have not asked who it is for because I do not think Grisick knows either. 6 hours, 0 deaths, which is not the same as no cost. A brother named Prade went through the third barricade at full speed in the 5th hour, with the man behind him a half-step early, and the half-step put a chain axe through the back of his knee joint where the plate articulates. And the joint is not repairable with what Grisik has, and neither is what was inside it. He will hold the ship. He said nothing about it while the serfs were getting the plate off him, and he has said nothing about it since, and what he did do was ask me from the deck whether the drill had been called clean. I told him it had. That was the correct answer, and it was also a lie, because the man behind him was early, and I had seen it, and I had let the run continue instead of stopping it, on the grounds that a stack which halts every time somebody is a half-step off is a stack that will halt on Helvrant. At the 4th hour, I walked the perimeter and found 3 wall panels driven inward by brothers hitting them at the end of a run, and I was pleased, because panels buckle when men are moving the way the breach will require them to move. That assessment was correct, and I would make it again. At the 5th hour, it produced Prade, who is 190 years old, and who will spend the assault sitting in a corridor on a ship in orbit, while the thing he was drilled for happens without him, and the war band is at 162 before anybody has fired a shot. I put that in the stock report myself. I have written a great many of those, and that is the first one, where the number moved because of something I decided. Ulbrich ran the point of the stack every time, because that is the position he has been given, and there is no sense practicing any other one. He is not the best breacher in the war band, and he never was. He was a sergeant of the 9th 400 years ago, and he has spent 4 centuries in the line since, and what he has is not speed and not reach, but the thing that cannot be taught, which is that he goes through the doorway on the count without deciding to. I ran him against the barricade until his pauldrons were scored down to the bare ceramite, and I corrected him twice, and both corrections were small. He will die on Helvrant. He knows that, and I know it, and I drilled him anyway, and drilled him well, because the alternative is sending a man to hold the point of a stack, with the last 400 years of his life unfinished. And I have not yet sent anyone into a doorway underprepared, and I was not starting with him. The blood that was spilled was the blood of men learning to do the thing they were made to do. And I stood at the edge and watched and directed, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I did not feel the nothing. I felt the yard, not the fire, not the god, something smaller and older, competence coming back. I cleaned the yard at the end of the session. 6 hours of breaching drills produces a specific kind of debris: shattered barrier material, gouged deck plate, blood in long, shallow streaks rather than the pooled circles of a standing fight. The debris told a story I had not read in 4 centuries. I replaced the consecration rack. I reseated the panels I had found buckled at the 4th hour and noted 2 more. The shrine was above me. 1 deck up through a corridor I have walked 10,000 times, past the sealed compartments and the dead lumens and the section where the hull plating still carries the scorch marks from the Black Templars' boarding torpedoes. It was late, past the 22nd bell, the dead hour when the mortal decks are quiet and the corridors are empty. I walked toward the brass. The skulls watched with their empty sockets. And I stopped because the air was different. Not warmer, not yet, but different the way the air is different before a storm, when the pressure has shifted and the sky has not caught up and the stillness has a charge in it. The shrine was holding its breath. I placed my hand on the arm of the brass. I felt metal, cold metal, the same as that morning. And then, underneath the cold, so faint that I almost missed it, I felt something that was not heat and was not cold and was not any temperature at all, but was instead the absolute smallest measurable unit of attention, the thinnest possible filament of a gaze so vast that the filament itself was almost nothing, the way the edge of a star's light at the rim of a solar system is almost nothing. Still technically the star's light, still technically falling on you, but so attenuated by distance that you could mistake it for background radiation if you were not specifically looking for it. I was looking for it, and it was there. Not a return, not a restoration, a whisper, a flicker. The pilot light in a furnace that has been cold for 6 weeks, catching on whatever trace of fuel remains in the line, burning so small that a breath could extinguish it, and so significant that the war band's existence depended on keeping it lit. I walked back to the yard. My cot is against the north wall behind the drainage pump. The foam has been replaced 9 times. The frame has never been replaced. I have lain on it approximately 4,000 times, and the frame knows the shape of my body the way the deck knows the shape of the stain, permanently and without sentiment. The yard was clean. The yard is always clean at the end of the day. In the morning, I will open it at the 7th bell and run the morning session and accept what it produces. In the afternoon, I will rebuild the barriers and plan the evening, which will be a second night of breach drills, and the night after that will be a third, and I will run them every evening for 5 weeks, until the Brenkeld translates into the Helvrint system, and the drop begins. Grisick went forward to the sealed compartment the night after the assembly. He was there 4 hours. Whatever passes between him and the woman behind that door passed, and afterward he told Skelvorn the corridor would hold, and that is the whole of what the warband knows about the crossing it is about to make. 5 weeks of rebuilding the thing we were. 5 weeks of a yardsman running a training program instead of a slaughter schedule, which is the work I was trained for before I was trained for anything else, and the work I stopped doing when the warband stopped needing it, and the warband stopped needing it because I let it stop needing it, and I will carry it the way I carry everything else, which is in the yard and on the deck, and in the stain that does not come up, no matter how long the hose runs. How the siege ends is not something I can tell you. What it does not fix, I can, which is a thing I have been turning over since the brass went cold under my hand and will not raise with anybody. Say it goes the way Skelvorn intends. Say we take the outer works and the citadel and the whole valley, and the blood is earned, and the brass runs hot enough to burn a bare hand. We will come off that world with fewer brothers than we landed with, and the apothecarium will not have improved, and the youngest of us will still be Kellak. The gaze does not put anyone back on his feet. Whatever we win on Helvrant, we win once, and then the lull starts again, and the number is smaller, and the next target has to be at least as hard or the gradient resumes from wherever we stopped. That is not a campaign plan. That is a man choosing which of 2 deaths his warband gets, and choosing it for all of us without a vote. He is right. Being right about it is the worst thing that has happened to this warband in 800 years. I know how it will begin because I am the man who will stack the first breach team and call the first entry and be the first brother through the first door in the first wall, because the yardsman goes first. The yardsman has always gone first, because the man who runs the yard in peacetime is the man who proves the yard's lessons are worth following in war. And if the yardsman dies in the door, then the lessons were not good enough, and the next yardsman will teach better ones. The blood god does not answer prayers. He does not grant mercy or favors or second chances. He watches, and when the blood is good, he takes it. And when the blood is not good, he does not. And the only communication he has ever offered is the warmth on the brass and the fire behind the eyes. And attention must be earned, and earning it requires you to bring the god something that cost you something. And we have not brought him anything that cost us anything in a very long time, and that is about to change. I cleaned the yard one more time. I hosed the deck. I checked the drainage. I replaced a cracked section of the consecration rack. I aligned the skull sitting crooked on its spike at the eastern end of the top row. I ran my hand along the railing, and the metal was the same temperature as everything else aboard the ship. And it was cold, and it was solid, and it was mine. Then I lay down on the cot, and I let half my brain go dark, and I waited for morning. And the half that stayed awake carried the fire, and the fire was small, and the fire was not enough, and the fire was everything I had.